to keep track of the social media platforms that encourage us to express ourselves and contribute to us being the most connected we have ever been. Yet as people, we are so disconnected and so disenfranchised. Everyone wants to know what somebody else thinks, but this is not in order to celebrate diversity and ensure equity and inclusion, but rather to control your narrative, your direction, and decide your opportunities. We go in hard to expose, reinvigorate, and solidify our humanness and humanhood by having hard conversations centered around the question, is being a good person the same as being a good citizen? And who decides which is best? Everyone has feelings, beliefs, struggles, and dreams. But not everyone is bold enough or given the chance to speak openly about these and hold on to them. If you want to be sure you understand why society does not necessarily want good people, but instead wants good citizens, don't miss an episode. Is the present Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project helpful or harmful? And in the name of diversity, equity and inclusion, is society becoming more chaotic? Well, I'm sure you all have an answer to those questions, and I would love to know your view. So please express your views in the comment section. But before you do that, take some time and listen on. What you hear may sway your opinion or reinforce your position. I felt that I had to take a go at tackling these questions, having read the backstory to a number of headlines that caught my eye, like for instance, that published by the Telegraph newspaper on the 4th of April 2023, titled, and I quote, "Say Pregnant People, NHS Watchdog tells staff in gender-neutral drive," end of quote, where the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, otherwise referred to as NICE, is driving a narrative which dissociates pregnancy and childbirth from women. And as the GP, Dr. Louis Irvine, told the Telegraph, quote, "Abandoning sex and instead using ideological concepts such as gender identity is not a sound basis for communication tasked to support the health of the nation," end of quote. A point of interest, Dr. Louise Irvin describes gender identity as an ideological concept. Gender identity in this context for this doctor has no scientific relevance, but instead is based on or relating to a set of opinions or beliefs. Another article of interest is that published by the Telegraph newspaper again on the 31st of March 2023. And again I quote, "Chaplin awarded £10,000 after NHS Trust said diversity takes precedence over religious belief," end of quote. The Reverend at the centre of this incident is also a former consultant neurologist, and his claim against the London NHS Trust for harassment, religious discrimination and victimisation that resulted in his employment contract being terminated was settled out of court to the tune of £10,000. Now, what led to this Reverend's termination? Well, apparently, when asked by a patient who was in a same-sex relationship for his opinion on him, the patient, marrying his partner, the Reverend responded, quote, "What do you think God would say to you about this?" End of quote. This comment got the Reverend terminated from his position at the hospital. Yet in response to the settlement, a spokesperson from the NHS Trust said, quote, "We remain absolutely committed to promoting equality, diversity and inclusion for our patients, staff and communities. We respect and celebrate all protected characteristics equally, including religion, race, sexual orientation, disability, sex, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, and pregnancy and maternity. We take seriously our responsibility to ensure patients' spiritual needs are met and oppose any form of discrimination. End of quote. Now, did the trust respect the Reverend's religious belief? He was terminated for posing the question, and I quote again, "What do you think God would say to you about this?" End of quote. Are we to believe that by saying this, the Reverend somehow disrespected a protected characteristic? And by terminating the Reverend, does this confer with the NHS's Trust's pledge that it opposes discrimination? It appears to have discriminated against him. Another headliner of interest, published by HR News on the 12th of April 2023, says, quote, "Almost 80% of UK businesses pay men more than women." End of quote. And as the article points out, the difference in pay is about 10%. We all know that this is unfair, but the comment that stood out the most for me is that the pay gap, and I quote, "remains the same level as 5 years ago, despite the many efforts to promote gender equality in the business sphere." End of quote. At this point, I would like to say that I believe the use of the word gender in the quote I gave obviously relates to the legal sex of an individual. Now, although I am prepared to give some leeway to pay differences in some industries where perhaps the average man is able to perform some tasks easier than their average female colleague, I am astonished at the pay gap in the banking and finance industries, where both the male and female roles for any given job would be similar. Yet, women are earning around 22% less than their male colleagues. It is disgraceful that this is allowed to happen in the 2020s, despite equality and non-discriminatory legislation being in place for decades, and especially in light of the push for diversity, equity, and inclusion. After all, women have always been around. They are not a recently identified diverse group, so if they are struggling to be treated fairly, what does this tell us about the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project? Is it really about equality and inclusion, or does it have another purpose? Well, an article published by the HR Director in July 2021 titled, and I quote, "UK organisations have a long way to go with diversity and inclusion," end of quote, kind of answers that question. As does the belief of almost half of the UK employees surveyed, and again I quote, "Their organisation is more interested in categorising them just to look good," end of quote, which affirms that the diversity, equity and inclusion agenda is a mere tick box exercise, a compliance exercise that in 2023 is still not creating a truly inclusive experience for everyone. So what's the real point of the diversity, equity and inclusion agenda? Why is it being pushed so hard and not being ripped to shreds for not delivering what it says? Well, let me offer some food for thought. On the 14th of April 2023, The Telegraph published an article titled, quote, "Parents' Fury as Children Told a Sex Change Can Stop Bullying." It tells of the use of material in sex education classes that inform students as young as 14-year-olds that, and I quote, "puberty is optional and that there are 7 genders," end of quote. Now, apparently, this is done in aid of gender diversity. Now, what consideration is given here for the protection of children? Yes, the protection of children who are largely produced through heterosexual means, and the protection of the parents to rear their children in a way that they choose. Now, as to whether the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Charter is making society more chaotic, perhaps the Sky News report on the 18th of April 2023, titled, quote, trans pupils could be denied admission. Let me start again with that. The quote, trans pupils could be denied admission to single-sex schools under new guidance being considered. End of quote. Shed some light on this. Now, the guidance which is being drawn up by the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, and Equalities Minister, Kem Badenhoek, is expected to inform same-sex schools that they will not be in breach of the Equality Act if they refuse to admit transgender pupils. Now, this is going to be very interesting moving forward. But it is understandable that an all-girls school should be allowed to reject applications from pupils identifying as female but whose legal sex is male, and vice versa for all boys' schools. Why? Well, this presents all sorts of challenges, not only for the school and its leaders, but also for those who identify as their legal sex. But it doesn't end there. According to the Sky News report, school leaders will also be informed that, and I quote, they will be allowed to refuse to use a pupil's preferred pronoun. Now, once again, this is interesting, because children as young as 14 are being taught that there are 7 genders, yet their school leaders can decide to refer to them as boy, girl, male or female, a demonstration of more chaos arising in the name of diversity, equity and inclusion. So could it be that the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Charter or project is an experiment? A project? Yes, an experiment or project similar to that of slavery, which, as the facts show, left the descendants of those enslaved with deep traumatic damage and fueled the descendants of the enslavers with an ongoing sense of superiority and privilege. Although some may disagree, I believe that slavery began as an economic project, which quickly necessitated justification as to why people of one skin colour were the slaves and those of another skin colour the enslavers. Incoming, the divisor, race. Yes, the concept of race was invented or developed to uphold the economic system of capitalism and justify the genocidal project slavery. Now, align this to the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project, a project invented to do what? Well, as the articles I discussed earlier suggest, it's not focused on protecting religious characteristics. It's not focused on equitable and inclusive treatment for women. Instead, it seems to be more concerned with gender diversity than any of the other characteristics it places under its umbrella. After all, race discrimination is still a major problem in society. Sex discrimination is still a major problem in society, and the marginalization of religion is increasing. So, if gender is central to the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Charter, what is the aim of this project? Is it too far-fetched then to consider it a means to stem population growth? After all, population size, especially of young people, has to be viewed as a source of future power. Or is the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion agenda a project designed to distract us? A project designed to create mayhem and chaos, while a said few secure their legacy of economic and social dominance. Slavery was not only about free labour for economic gain, it was also about breaking those of a particular skin colour into submission. Submission so they viewed themselves as inferior, submission so they did as they were told, submission so they knew not to rock the boat, because if they did, this had dire consequences for them, consequences that were life-threatening. Increasingly, we face outrage. We are ostracized and we can be stripped of our economic means of survival if we voice an alternative opinion to that promoted by the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project. It appears that not towing the line of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project, which is heavily biased towards gender, comes with consequences, and these consequences are becoming graver by the day. But on the flip side of all of that, if we sit back and say nothing, then life as we know it will change drastically. Do you see any similarities emerging? Well, the fact that the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project has the potential to invoke drastic change on the world as we know it means it is something that we all must concern ourselves with. Because if we don't, perhaps in generations to come, it will be aligned alongside slavery as yet another horrendous genocide committed by humans. If we stand back and take a look at the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project, we will see that it is premised on the concept of division. And as dictionary definitions confer, division correlates with separation or keeping apart. Division is also coupled with tension-producing situations. So, if division is at the heart of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project, how then can it be expected to maximize inclusion and minimize dissension? Let's explore this. Over the years, we have become increasingly obsessed with division, and this is swiftly spiraling out of control. It has now come to the point where newer divisions and their associating constituents drive a louder, more consuming narrative. And we are literally being forced to accept every kind of division put forward under the umbrella of diversity. Otherwise, we face a real possibility of being labelled with a seemingly negative tag. So let's discuss diversity. It is fair to say that diversity can be portrayed under two distinct pillars. The first being the objective and impartial pillar, where the division is unbiased and neutral. And the second pillar being focused on division that is based on or influenced by our personal feelings, our tastes, our opinions, which makes it subjective. Now, what we are faced with today under the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project is a merging, a blurring of both pillars. But are both pillars getting the same level of promotion and attention? And in the grand scheme of things, should both the objective pillar and the subjective pillar of diversity be given the same level of consideration? Would shifting the focus to one pillar at the expense of the other provide society with a simpler route to the attainment of equality and inclusion? And if so, would the concept of inclusion cause less dissension? And what would society look like? So let's go back to basics. Let's return to the fundamental aspects of division and give our attention to the simplest and most important aspects of diversity, which perhaps we have been ignoring for decades, if not centuries. The natural world has a natural order. This order is normal. It is the norm. It is normality. Should variations from that which is natural, from that which is normal, then not be viewed as deviations from the norm, and therefore abnormal? If so, then as the dictionary defines, deviating from that which is normal can result in a condition or situation that is undesirable or worrying. The scientific classification of a human is Homo sapiens. Some term us as modern humans, others wise human. The modern I can live with, but wise is something I am increasingly questioning. As individuals of the natural group humans, we are all diverse. So there is no requirement to divide ourselves further into groups or constituents to satisfy the term diversity. The next natural division for us as clever humans has to be that of male and female. And again, this is driven by science. We are born with certain sexual organs, and this determines why we fit into one group or the other. Therefore, a man is a man regardless of his ethnicity. One equals the other. Even if one man is taller than the other, they are both men. There is no special or equitable treatment required for them to be men. The same is true for women. The use of the words woman and man, or women and men, reflect the terms that have been historically used to gender people. It is the natural order of classification. Science is based on there being a norm or a base. However, as we know, science does cater for variations. But these are often referred to as deviations because they are, as expected, compared against the norm or the base. For example, science tells us that persons who have discrepancies between their external genitalia and their internal reproductive organs have an intersex condition. These conditions are sometimes referred to as orders of sexual development or hermaphroditism. Science tells us that such conditions are extremely rare and that there is treatment for the intersex condition. Similarly, science confirms that bisexuality involves the production of both male and female sex cells. I repeat, bisexuality involves the production of both male and female sex cells. So for a person to be bisexual in the true sense of science means they have a sexual development disorder and therefore have an intersex condition, which is usually referred to as hermaphroditism. There is no other scientifically accepted definition of bisexuality. So a person who produces just male or just female sex cells alone, who then claims they are bisexual, does not fall within the scientific definition. So can they then be considered bisexual? Not according to science. I point this out to highlight the point that the fundamental aspects of human classification are objective and impartial, and only these can ever fall under this pillar. As hierarchical classification goes, these feature at the top, and perhaps it is this level of division that should guide our approach and vision for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Science informs that one cannot choose their sex. They are either male or female, girl or boy. However, persons are at liberty to choose their sexual behavior. And this, as part of the diversity conundrum, largely falls under the subjective pillar. And because it is just that, subjective, it stands to reason that not everyone will view these choices in the same way. And not everyone will be willing to accept them as normal. After all, sexual behavior is an individual's personal choice. And a sexual disorder, as science declares it, is a deviation from a norm or a base. Now, a paedophile may use the argument that they are born the way they are. But are we to conclude from that their behavior is normal? And under the banner of diversity, would we be calling for everyone to accept their behavior as normal? These are a couple of questions for you to think about. And let's not get on our high horses and say a paedophile sexual behavior is illegal and this group of individuals will never be promoted and recognized as a standalone diverse group under the banner of diversity. Why do I say this, I hear you ask? Well, I say this because, as reported in the Guardian newspaper on the 23rd of May 2017, despite the existence of the Sexual Offences Act of 1967, quote, don't fall for the myth that it is 50 years since we decriminalised homosexuality, end of quote. Gay sex only ceased to be a crime in the UK in the year 2013. Yet, in less than 10 years, as part of the current diversity, equity and inclusion project, The diverse group to which homosexual individuals belong has a strong voice, drives its own specific narrative, and receives significant focus. So, as discussed, we can see the chaos the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project is raining down on society by its merging, blurring, twisting and contorting of the terms sex and gender. Chaos is also fueled through the incessant narrative that there should be widespread acceptance of sex and gender being two distinct divisions, which both fall under diversity's objective and impartial pillar. Because it is only by giving and receiving this acceptance that inclusion will be achieved. And we all live happily ever after. But is there another view of the living happy ever after picture to the one painted by the present Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project? Well, perhaps there is, and perhaps it should be given some attention. It may well prove to be a worthy pursuit. I like science, so I will now use mathematics to present you with another aspect of the hypocrisy of the present vision of diversity, equity and inclusion. We are taught mathematics in schools, and the principles that support what we are taught are supposedly scientifically grounded. I'm sure you will agree. The equal to sign is the equal to sign, full stop. The outcome to the left-hand side of this symbol must be the same as that to the right. There are potentially many combinations that can exist on either side, but the equal to sign dictates that regardless of the combinations, the end result of each side has to be the same. If the end result to the left of the equal to sign is not the same as that to the right of the sign, then it is clear that this deviates away from the meaning of the equal to sign. So what would this mean? Well, it could mean that something is recorded incorrectly on one or both sides of the equation, and this requires correction. Or it could signify that what is recorded to the left of the equal to sign is correct, as is what is recorded to the right of the equal to sign. Therefore, what would then be required is that which is between the two. And as expected, mathematics has a solution for that, the not equal to sign. Once this is inserted, as one would expect, what is to the left-hand side of this symbol does not have to equal that which is to the right. And that which is now in front of us is correct. Yippee! Now, if a child does not comprehend this basic mathematical principle whilst at school, it is quite possible that they could be labelled with the learning difficulty tag. So why is this basic principle being eroded in society today and not enough emphasis placed on the consequences of doing so? Simply put, it is as a result of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project. This has taken on an identifiable image and narrative, one that paints a specific picture of inclusion and promotes equity as targeted special treatment. And both aspects, we are being told, are necessary in the spirit of recognizing equality in division. Now, there is an oxymoron worth exploring: equality in division. Now, in an interview conducted earlier this year, Idris Elba stated, quote, "As humans, we are obsessed with race," end of quote. And this, quote, obsession can really hinder people's aspirations, end of quote, and their, quote, growth, end of quote. Yet another pertinent statement. We are obsessed with race. Yet, as discussed earlier, the concept of race was created to justify why it was okay to enslave people of one skin color and for those of another to be the enslavers. And although the so-called abolishing of slavery took place, we find today, yes, in 2023, that race discrimination is still a major problem in the UK. As reported by experts of a UN working group in January of this year, quote, racism in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is structural, institutional and systemic, end of quote. But did the 1999 Macpherson report not say a similar thing, quote, institutional racism, end of quote? And did the same report not highlight that this racism was at both an individual and institutional level? Yet, over 20 years later, an expert group from the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner highlight the same issue. So what has the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project done for this lately? As the evidence suggests, not very much at all. So is race, as a diverse group, making a difference to those who make up this group? Just asking. Perhaps it's time we considered a different approach. So let's step back in time for a minute, back to our basic mathematics class in which we are learning about the equal to sign and not equal to sign. On the board, the teacher writes in white chalk the number 2, then the equal to sign, and then in red chalk they write the number 2. Now, if when the class is asked whether this is correct or not, a child responds that it is incorrect because the number 2 is a different color, should the teacher agree with the child or not? Similarly, if the teacher writes in green chalk the number 1, then the equal to sign, and continues writing in green chalk the number 2, would it not be expected that the teacher would explain to a child who thought this was correct why it is incorrect? And finally, if the teacher writes in blue chalk the number 3, followed by the not equal sign, and then writes in yellow chalk the number 4, followed by the minus sign, and then the number 1, would it not be expected that the teacher would explain to a child who thought this was incorrect why it is indeed correct, although the numbers on each side do not look the same? You see the point I'm making here? The Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project wants us to believe some things are the same when clearly they are not. And it wants us to believe some things are different when clearly they are not. And all in the name of inclusion and equality. Now let's take a look at how the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project in the UK handles ancestry and how inclusion plays out for those constituents who are assigned and aligned to specific ethnic or racial groups. I will use the example of Shamima Begum. Yes, Shamima Begum, a young woman of 23 years who at the age of 15 made the decision to leave her UK home and flee to Syria to join the Islamic State. She was born in the UK, so she is by birth a British citizen. But here is how diversity plays a role in her case. Even though she has never been to Bangladesh and has no links to the country besides that established by her heritage, it has been determined by the British government that revoking her British citizenship does not make her stateless. Now, what could be the reason for that? Well, I guess if she was asked the question, "Where are you from?" enough times, the expectation is that eventually Bangladesh would surface. And perhaps that's good enough to determine that she would not be left stateless. The fact that she has Bangladeshi ancestry appears to give credence to the argument to revoke her citizenship and renders the decision to do so as viable and acceptable. So, for diversity's sake, Shamima Begum is a woman, a British citizen with Bangladeshi heritage. In essence, she fits into 3 distinct diverse groups. It is clear that Shamima Begum's ancestry as an element of diversity was instrumental in her exclusion from being considered a fully fledged British citizen who would be stateless if her British citizenship was taken away from her. So when did Shamima Begum's Bangladeshi heritage become her other nationality? Well, according to Section 40 of the British Nationality Act 1981, quote, the Secretary of State may by order deprive a person of a citizenship status if the Secretary of State is satisfied that the deprivation is conducive to the public good, because the person, while having that citizenship status, has conducted him or herself in a manner which is seriously prejudicial to the vital interests of the United Kingdom, any of the islands, or any British overseas territory. And the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds for believing that the person is able, under the law of a country or territory outside the United Kingdom, to become a national of such a country or territory. End of quote. It is clear that Shamima Begum's association with the Islamic State would be viewed as seriously prejudicial to the vital interests of the United Kingdom, any of the islands, or any British overseas territory. So, on the face of it, this covers the decision made by the Secretary of State. But does it? Can it be assumed that Shamima Begum's ancestry enables her, under the law of Bangladesh, to become a national of that country? Well, in this case, based on the decision, it appears that it can. So the question arises, what would have happened to a 23-year-old woman, a British citizen of Scottish, Welsh, or Irish heritage, or a 23-year-old woman, a British citizen with both English and, say, African or Caribbean heritage, who found themselves in the same position as Shamima Begum? Taking all three women given in the example, the only way to ensure that all are treated equally and equitably requires that the information level which informs the case as to whether their British citizenship could be revoked would be the fact that they are all British citizens, and to revoke their citizenship would leave them stateless. The research briefing Deprivation of British Citizenship and Withdrawal of Passports found on the House of Commons online library says as much, and I quote, someone who was born British and has no other nationality cannot be deprived of their citizenship in any circumstances. End of quote. Now, the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project in the UK wants us to believe that under the British citizen banner or grouping, we are all viewed the same. We are all British citizens. But as the Shamima Begum example shows, regardless of being a British citizen by birth, if, quote, the Secretary of State has reasonable grounds for believing that a person is able, under the law of a country or territory outside the United Kingdom, to become a national of such a country or territory, end of quote, their British citizenship can be revoked on the basis that they have inherited links to another country. This is scary and a total contradiction of inclusion. So what does this tell us? Well, if we take diversity as a key aspect of society, we know that as individuals we are classified, assigned and allied to certain groups, which means we are included in that group. However, as discussed, being classified, assigned and allied to the British citizen group does not come with the same level of inclusion for all its members. But guess what? This should come as no surprise. The UK's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project is founded on the principle of division, and there always being another level of division to drill down into, and all this in the name of equity. Now, was it possible for the Secretary of State to take another view of Shamima Begum's case in the name of diversity, equity and inclusion? Let's take a look. Shamima Begum could have been viewed as a young woman of 23 years who made a terrible childhood mistake at the age of 15, which resulted in her fleeing her home in the UK and joining the Islamic State in Syria. Now, applying equity to the Shamima Begum matter would see age surface as a major factor. Yes, it would see age surface as a major factor for consideration, as well as level of maturity. Both of these are key features that require due consideration in the process leading up to the Secretary of State's decision to revoke Shamima Begum's British citizenship. If we are to believe that the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project in the UK is committed to fairness and equality. But it is fair to say that age and level of maturity appear not to have been considered, and hypocrisy to the highest order is on display. If you don't believe me, listen on. The Education Act of 1996, Section 8, establishes compulsory school age as starting at the age of 5 years and ending at the age of 16 years. The Act makes it clear that between this age range, a child or young person cannot decide they no longer want to go to school. So Section 7A of the same Act makes it clear that a parent or guardian must ensure that a child of compulsory school age receive efficient full-time education suitable to their age, ability and aptitude. A young person cannot choose to leave school at the age of 15, nor can a young person of this age seek full-time work, as the Employment Act of 2002 confirms. So if a young person in the UK is not deemed mature enough to make these somewhat permanent and defining decisions, why was this not a consideration in this case? The Shamima Begum example provides a good illustration of the contradiction of inclusion and something that is ever present within the context of the current Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project. The quality of Shamima Begum's human experience as a British citizen who, as a young person, as defined by the Children and Young Persons Act of 1993, made perhaps the most terrible mistake a young person could ever make, demonstrates that inclusion is not a natural consequence. It doesn't just happen because you supposedly belong to the collective whole. Diversity is a relational concept that seeks out difference. So the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project, which we are encouraged to embrace, by its very nature renders the act of inclusion fluid, forever changing and open to interpretation. What do you think? We are encouraged to focus on what makes us different, to comply with the diversity tick box exercise, only then to fight to be included, so that the inclusion aspect of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project is supposedly satisfied. We are constantly being bombarded with the context of equality in division. But isn't the whole point of division to stand apart from something? So why distance yourself from the norm or the base, only then to want to be included? Just asking. As Idris Elba stated earlier this year in his interview with Esquire, and I quote, "If we spent half the time not talking about the differences, but the similarities between us, the entire planet would have a shift in the way we deal with each other." End of quote. But this type of approach does not sit comfortably within the present vision of the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project. If we took Idris's suggestion and focused on our similarities and not our differences, we would have to ditch the never-ending divisions and groupings that the present Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project incessantly promote. This brings us back to the natural division of human beings and the two distinct base groups, male and female. If no two fingerprints of the same person are the same, and no two persons' fingerprints are the same, then this in itself is proof and sufficient confirmation that as individuals we are all different, we are all unique, and therefore we are diverse. So in essence, there is really no need to make diversity such a big issue. It exists without the headlines. It is part of nature and therefore the norm. If this was the approach taken, then equality would take on a different face. It would be clear that every man is equal regardless of any differences, and the same goes for women. Now, that is not to say that there are no differences worth attention, but it is also true to say that these differences would be established through comparison against a norm or a base. So let's ponder this for a while. If race is a difference worth targeted treatment, what race is the scientifically established norm or base race? You see why race in the name of diversity becomes problematic? And that is why I agree with Idris Elba's stance that he no longer calls himself a, quote, black actor, end of quote. Elba took a battering on social media for this comment, which he made in his interview with Esquire. Social media lit up with message after message painting Idris Elba as a man trying to distance himself from his blackness. Many of the comments spouted were toxic. Idris was portrayed as a man committing racial betrayal, a sellout. But how could he do that? How dare he decide to drop the descriptive term black when the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project dictates that he use it? After all, is he not black? But come on, those of you who saw the need to post disparaging comments about Idris, what utter nonsense. Why does Idris Elba need to say, I am a black actor? Do Brad Pitt, Robert Downey Jr., Tom Cruise, Johnny Depp, Matt Damon, or Leonardo DiCaprio call themselves white actors? Get a grip, people. Stop buying into the false concept that diversity by race is something we should promote without question, and that using the given terminology black must be employed at every juncture. Why are you using it? Because others expect you to? As if stating that you are black brings some sort of equitable reward in today's world, where the concept of diversity, equity and inclusion is being heavily promoted. Quite the contrary. Ask yourself, what real benefit does diversity based on visible characteristics deliver, and who benefits from these metrics the most? The person being classified or those collecting the metric? So let's discuss equity. The World Economic Forum sees equality as an end goal and equity as the way to get to that goal. The World Economic Forum says, and I quote, equality means that we treat everyone equally. Each person or group of people is given the same resources and opportunities. Equity means that we provide resources and opportunities that fit the specific needs or circumstances of that person or group, and in that way we can reach an equal outcome. End of quote. Now, a couple of things stand out here. As we all know, nothing stays the same. Things are constantly changing, second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. You get my drift, I could go on. So, if equality is viewed as an end goal and equity as the process to get there, it stands to reason that the end goal of equality will never be achieved. Time does not stand still. Something new arises constantly, and as a result, the process should change to take account of that. But can the process change fast enough to cater for all these constantly new occurrences? If we are honest with ourselves, and as history confirms, processes, including the equity process, cannot change fast enough to cater for everything at all times. So we exist in a never-ending loop in pursuit of equality. The Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project takes a similar stance, where equity is about recognizing the difference between us and catering to our individual and group needs in order to make us all equal. So we are being encouraged to expect and accept difference of treatment because it is being done in the name of achieving equality. And we are being urged to understand that giving everyone the same resources or treating them equally somehow equates to inequality. Now, this is interesting and correlates well with the phrase, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, Bill Scaninger, a senior partner and talent expert at McKinsey & Company, the global management consulting firm that is a trusted advisor to world's leading businesses, governments, and institutions in one of the McKinsey Talk Talent podcasts, offered a view on the implications of equity when sourcing talent. He is convinced that there is a real difference between equal and equitable, and used interns as an example. Quote, suppose we said all interns are created equal. We pay them nothing. The people who can afford an entire summer without getting paid are likely already coming from a position of privilege. End of quote. So Mr. Scaninger believes that if you cannot afford an entire summer without getting paid, you are less privileged. That's interesting. But suppose you can afford an entire summer without pay, but you want to be paid. What classification are you given then? To what group are you assigned and aligned? This is the problem with the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Project. New groups arise all the time, resulting in a state of firefighting and chaos. The decision to pay or not to pay is made by the organization. But what is this decision based on? It obviously isn't based on the group being interns, because if it was, it would be clear to the decision makers that paying them nothing is not a viable option. Why, I hear you ask? Well, it's simple. All interns are created equal. They are, for the most part, students or graduates who have no disposable income of their own. Now, taking that view means for each intern to afford an entire summer means they have to be paid something. And at a minimum, that means covering their transport costs to and from their homes to their place of internship, or providing transport, which is just the same as paying their transport costs. Now look at that. Equal and equitable rolled up into one. Some interns may get more than others because they travel further than others. But guess what? They are all treated equally. We see the same message time and time again, a decoupling of equal and equitable. And I came across an interesting example of this on the website of RISE, a national non-profit organization that empowers the sports community to eliminate racial discrimination, champion social justice, and improve race relations. It is a quote by an unknown author that reads, quote, equality is giving everyone the same pair of shoes. Equity is giving everyone a pair of shoes that fits. End of quote. I disagree. So let's break it down. First, we must establish what purpose the shoe serves. And as implied in the part of the quote related to equity, the shoes are to be worn. So now we can determine if giving everyone the same pair of shoes amounts to equality. Giving everyone the same pair of shoes, I'm assuming, means giving everyone a pair of shoes of a given size. So, for example, everyone receives a pair of, say, size 7 shoes. But is this equality? Of course not. How could it be? Although the shoes will not fit everyone, they will fit those persons whose feet are a size 7. This automatically brings about inequality. However, if the purpose of the shoe was, say, for it to be put on display, then yes, potentially everyone would have been treated equally. But if the purpose of the shoe is for it to be worn, then equality means that everyone would receive a pair of shoes that fit. There it is again, equal and equitable rolled nicely up into one under the heading of equality. It is important to know the purpose of that which is being done. And once we know that purpose, we can treat everyone equally. This is why blindly buying into the narrative that equality somehow means we have to be treated exactly the same or receive exactly the same resources is frankly BS. Equality, as the Cambridge Dictionary defines it, is, quote, the right of different groups of people to have a similar social position and receive the same treatment, end of quote. Or, as the definition in the Merriam-Webster dictionary specifies, quote, the quality or state of being equal, end of quote. On the website of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, it says, quote, equality is about ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to make the most of their lives and talents, end of quote. It is clear that slavery and colonization resulted in groups of people being marginalized and discriminated against, and the dominance of a specific sex and ability as leading decision makers has resulted in other forms of discrimination. But we must be cognizant that for decades we have witnessed project after project, policy after policy, law after law that speaks to advancing equality. Yet, here we are in 2023, focused on diversity and valuing difference. Equity as a standalone value itself has stoked many disagreements and raised many issues. It forces some to believe others are getting more than they are, and this should not be the case. And it makes some feel that they deserve more. It is fair to say that the past acts of some have significantly affected various groups, and this has to be addressed. But it is also important that we don't get caught up in yet another process which promises equality as an end goal. Yes, it is important that we don't get caught up in yet another process which promises equality as an end goal. For instance, it is well known that women are paid less than men. We discussed this earlier. So guess what? In the name of diversity, equity and inclusion, there is a simple remedy. Pay women the same as their male colleagues immediately. We want equality now. In the UK, we recently witnessed the launch of yet another policy in the same vein of diversity, equity and inclusion. It goes by the title of Levelling Up. And its primary aim is to reduce the economic imbalances that exist between different areas and social groups across the UK. It will be good to look back 50 years from now to see what difference this made. If I was to put money on it though, I would bet on it making very little difference. Why? Because history confirms that the odds of political policies, charters, projects and laws delivering what they say they will is very remote. But hey, let's take a look at this 50 years from now. For decades, it has been deemed necessary that equality will only come about with the presence of laws like the Equality Act and the presence of the Human Rights Charter and conducting projects which are carefully planned to achieve a particular aim, like that of diversity, equity and inclusion. Yet, in the year 2023, we are nowhere close to solving the inequality issue. Applying the famous line from George Orwell's novel Animal Farm to this situation, it is pertinent to say that, quote, all men are equal, but some men are more equal than others. We constantly chase the status of equality, whilst time and time again previous inequalities and tyrannies are replicated. The players change, but the game remains the same. Transformation demands a change in thinking, and we must go all the way. And as said earlier, we must demand equality now and not see it as a future state. The vision of inclusion as an integrated society where we are expected to accept everything we are told in the name of diversity and equity poses issues, as does the prospect of a society where we are told to accept that some things are the same as others even when they are not. On the face of it, the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project appears to be helpful, but don't be misled, it is also harmful. And in the name of diversity, equity and inclusion, society is becoming more chaotic. Within the ambits of the present Diversity, Equity and Inclusion project, diversity is about division, and division and inclusion are indeed, as Shakespeare said, strange bedfellows. As discussed here today, humans are obsessed with division, and as history confirms, and as reflected throughout society, division is the way to continuing inequality and exclusion. But is there, or could there, possibly be another vision of equality, one that does not see diversity and inclusion as strange bedfellows? Tune into our next episode to find out what I think. Thanks for taking the time to listen. We would love to know your views, so please make your comments below. Let's continue the discussion. This is Ava Dana. Look out for our next episode or press the subscribe button.
Thank you.